Welcome to the first talk for this year. Joe Sinclair is going to give us a talk on comics and related publications. And it follows on quite nicely from the last talk we had, which was Harry Woodward and the history of books. So I think we're in for a treat tonight. Joe moved to Lentwardine in 2020, background in management consultancy, and he says he's retired, but he's got quite an eclectic mix of activities that he's involved in. So he writes, he plays music on quite a few instruments, I believe. He's a meditation teacher and a hypnotherapist. So I think that all adds up to quite a lot of activity. He started collecting comics when he was 10, and many of you will have seen a sample of what he's brought along tonight. And I gather that's part of a set of 12,000 comics, which is some collection. I did say in the nicest possible way that Joe could almost not give the talk tonight and just let everybody have a look at the comics and just spend the evening doing that. But no, we want to hear from Joe. And I've no doubt that he will give us all a great sense of nostalgia in terms of some of the comics that we grew up with many years ago. Anyway, can we invite Joe to give us a presentation?
Thank you very much. That was a lovely welcome, and it's fantastic to see so many of you here with such smiley faces. You must all have been reading Beano earlier. Yeah. So the only bit you missed was Joe is also a very naughty boy, because when he was at school, when he was about 10, he paid very little attention to the lessons because he was reading comics under the desk while the lessons were going on. And on one occasion was hauled off by the teacher to the headmaster's study, who said to me, "What on earth are you doing reading a comic under the desk during the science lessons?" And my parents had always taught me to be very, very honest, so I said, "Well, because the comic was much more interesting than the lessons." So, yeah, you got it all. Going to start off with a slight apology, and the apology is to the ladies in the room, because this is mostly a talk about boys' papers. Nothing against girls' comics and papers at all, but the strange thing is, and nobody knows the reasons why unless you've come up with a theory, there are hardly any women collectors of comics in the country. There's lots and lots of blokes who collect comics from different ages and different decades, but there's very, very few women. And I've been to a few of these comic conventions, which is a bit like a train spotters convention full of blokes. But there's not really, because there's not many women collectors, there's not really a great market or a value put on the women's comics, which is sad, because I've bought some great examples today. And as well as a talk, it's a kind of an exhibition, because what I've done is I've bought about 100 of my collection tonight, ranging from the 1840s right through to the 1980s. And those two dates are significant because 1840s was really the dawn of what we call today comics, or boys' own papers and girls' own papers. And 1980 was probably the year when they went into very, very rapid decline. So for 140 years, that was the kind of golden period of comics. And the thing about comics is they're not just about stories and about characters. They're an absolute reflection of the social history of the time. So in every decade, fashions change, trends change, what's politically and economically acceptable or culturally acceptable changes, and we've all experienced that in our lives. And the comics reflect that. And so there's a lot of comics which are here today, which when you're browsing, and I hope you come and browse after the talk, are not politically correct in today's terms, but they're of their time, and they're a great reflection of social history. And I've started off with this particular picture on the first slide, because this boys' old paper, as is the correct term for it, boys' own paper, this is the very, very first edition of the boys' own paper, which came out in 1879. And it lasted at the top of its game till 1969. It was the most successful boys' paper that ever came out. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the boy's own paper. But first, I thought, just to sort of break the ice, get a bit interactive, I've got 10 comic characters on the slides. And what I'd like you to do is, if you recognise the character, just shout out. Don't be shy. Just shout out who you're seeing. You get a point for that. And if you can say, and that character was from the name of the comic, you get a bonus point. So what's not to like? So it starts very simple. Dennis the Menace, who was in... Yeah, well, everyone knows. Well, that's brilliant. Who's this? Desperate Dan from? You're good. Who's this, though? There's a clue by looking at the colour of his hair. Ginger? He's Ginger from? Beano? The Beezer. Beryl, the Peril from the Topper. Brilliant. Dan Deere, my personal favourite, my hero. Yes. From the Eagle, and there's a lovely copy of the Eagle on the table at the back there. Who knows this character?
Is that Roy? Yeah.
Roy of the Rovers from the Tiger. And what's interesting about this particular picture is that when he started out in the 1950s, he had a very, very 1950s haircut. This was when he was in the early 1970s. So he's grown his hair long, as people did in that particular year, an example of the social history. The famous Roy of the Rovers. Now there's one. Who can remember this guy? You don't need a clue to his name.
Victor?
No, this guy is from The Lion, one of the most popular stories in The Lion. He's called Robert Archie, and he was around a long, long time before AI and all that sort of stuff. But he was a bit of a detective and a problem solver that went around doing good deeds. And yeah, he was a bit of a hero. Robert Archie. Now, Billy Bunter, one of the most successful comic characters of all time. I'll talk a little bit more about Bunter later. And he was in a number of different comics, but principally in the two called The Magnet and the Gem, very, very strong comics in the 30s and 40s. Now, this one might be a bit of a mystery. You can have a guess. It's almost identical to Sherlock Holmes, and in fact there's a connection to Sherlock Holmes, but this is a detective who was in his day, for about 70 years, he was top of the game in the detective stories, and his name was Sexton Blake. Yeah, and I think there's a connection because the writers who used to write Sexton Blake, they worked alongside Conan Doyle, who was a comic writer as well. So this one you probably won't recognise, but this was the most significant character, the guy with his hands up in the air in black. For well on nigh 100 years, he was the most popular comic character. But he's in the Penny Dreadfuls, pre-comics. So from about 1840 to about 1890, he was one of the main characters in the comics.
And his name?
His name is Varney the Vampire. Yeah. And I'll talk more about Varney the Vampire very shortly. So I'm not going to talk too much about when I started collecting comics and where I got them from, all that, but you can ask me questions at the end. But I collected as a child, and I loved the British comics. Absolutely adored them, and I roamed the back streets of Brighton, where I was living near at the time, when you could pick up loads and loads of comics for a few pennies. And I had this thing about, I loved the kind of British hero with a stiff upper lip, flesh and blood kind of characters who didn't have any superpowers. They were just strong in who they were. And when I was going around all these shops looking and buying all these old comics with my pocket money, there was also loads and loads of American comics. Very, very different. You might remember the DC comics and the Marvel comics, and they had superheroes. And I've just made a note here that these comic heroes from the US, they were made of things like rubber, yeah, smoke, ice, rock, fire, and they could fly through the air, yeah? And they could have laser beams coming out of the palms of their hands, and some of them had strange affinities with spiders or bats, yeah? Remember Batman, Spider-Man? And for me, they were not authentic, real characters. So I totally ignored them and sort of threw them down on the pile, all these old Batmans and Supermans and what have yous, and I just concentrated on British comics. If I'd have done it the other way round and collected the American comics at that time, late 60s, early 70s, instead of the British ones, I wouldn't be here tonight. I'd be in my penthouse in Hawaii or Malibu, because they've accelerated in value at a phenomenal rate. I mean, they really are. They're worth thousands now. And the British comics are nowhere near the American comics. So, yeah, I think I sort of bet on the wrong horse a little bit there, but no regrets. Right, now is a question. You might not know the answer to the question, but I think you could have a very good guess. What do the following famous writers all have in common? If you probably recognise quite a few of these names. What do they all have in common?
They all wrote for comics.
They all wrote for comics before they became famous. In fact, some of them probably wouldn't have become famous until they got known through their writing serials for the major comics. So in the early days of comics and in the Penny Dreadfuls, the publishers used to take submissions from writers, and they would then decide which writers they were going to publish and which writers they wouldn't accept. But the bloodier and gorier and more horrific the stories were, the more likely you were to get them into the Penny Dreadfuls. So all these people cut their teeth on writing for the British comics before they went into print as famous authors. And you can see there's some quite well-known names there. Yeah. So originally, they were called British Boys' Papers rather than comics. But in reality, from about 1840 through to about 1870, they were actually called Penny Dreadfuls or Bloods. Those were the two names that were given. And there's quite a few Penny Dreadfuls and Bloods on the top table here to have a look at. So they didn't really become comics as we would know them till about 1884. I think that was the first actual official comic. And the Penny Dreadfuls were very, very different from the comics. The main difference was there was no censorship. You could write what you liked. The more horrific and scary and awful the Penny Dreadfuls were, the more the youth of the day and adults lapped them up. But eventually, by about 1884, there was a bit of a moral outcry about the damaging the youth of today, and they started to make Christians much more acceptable, not just in better printing, better language, better grammar, but more kind of uplifting and what boys should be doing, Boy Scouts, great stories. The Penny Dreadfuls are just kind of complete horror, but they've got a place in history as well. And I'll read you a couple of short extracts. So, yeah, I've made a note here that the first actual official comic, if you like, was called Ali Sloper's Half Holiday, and I'll show you a picture of that as well. So these are a few of the typical Penny Dreadfuls from 1840, 1850, 1860. They're all very, very similar. You'd only get a picture on the front page, which kind of would draw you into buying the comic, but the next 10 pages were absolutely dense prose. No paragraphing, no editing or checking of spelling, no grammar checks. It just went in longhand to the typesetters, and they would typeset it and they'd print it and put it out. So they were pretty poorly done, and the poor writers who submitted, when they first started in, say, 1845, 1850, they were getting paid 1 penny for every 100 pages of prose. Yeah, yeah. But a lot of people still did it because they thought that was their way into writing books later on to make more money. So this was the very, very official recognised adults' boys' comic paper that was not classed as a penny dreadful because it was more uplifting. And it was every edition every week was about a working class hero called Ali Sloper. Very, very successful. But a lot of the readers of the old penny dreadfuls thought, it's too nice, don't like this. Next slide. Yeah, this again is a very, very typical, absolutely typical example of a penny dreadful. You would pick them up in newsagents, you'd pick them up from street vendors, tobacconist shops, all over London predominantly, and then they started spreading out to the other cities around Great Britain. And generally, one person would buy them and hand them on to a friend, and they'd read it and pass it on again, and eventually it got down, the teenagers read them. They were extremely popular at the time, selling in their thousands, if not millions, but very, very few survive today. The best collection is in the British Museum, where you can see all the penny dreadfuls. They've been collecting them for many, many years. Other than that, you just find them in the hands of collectors. So why was it around 1840 that this all happened? Well, there were 2 or 3 reasons. One was that literacy, children's literacy was on the rise. The teaching in schools how to read and write was coming up leaps and bounds, and more young people could read, and they were demanding more and more stories. So literacy was a growth in literacy was one of the main things. And the other 2 things were the quality of typesetting and printing was going through rapid improvements and changes, and also the manufacture of paper was going through lots of progressive stages. So those 3 things, the increase in literacy, the better printing standards, and the better access to good paper, was where it kind of went from very little to a massive explosion of penny dreadfuls after 1840. This was, if someone wanted to read the whole history of boys' comics, the definitive book is this. It's a brilliant book. It's called Boys Will Be Boys, and it's a complete history of juvenile literature in the penny dreadful era and comics. So I've got a lot of information from that book. And in the book it says that I'll read it out, popular fiction of the early 19th century was steeped in darkness and diablerie, spectres gliding in green phosphorescence, hags picking over the bones of charnel houses, death heads in closets, heirs to great estates chained in dungeons, forests stuffed with robbers and werewolves, and graves creaking open in the moonlight to let vampires out. These were the stock in trade of the Gothic and the bogus Gothic writers. So yeah, that's what you're kind of reading. And one of the most prolific and most famous writers was a guy called Reynolds. I don't know his first name. It wasn't in the book, but he was the one that always got printed because he was gorier and more horrific than all the other writers. So he went top of the pile. And describing him in the book, it says, Reynolds left little to his reader's imagination. His slums were incestuous, pox-ridden hells in which pigs ate the bodies of newly dead babes, and hardened undertakers' men fainted at the sights which met their eyes. Humpbacked dwarfs, harridans and grave robbers groped past against a background of workhouses, jails, execution yards, thieves' kitchens and cemeteries. Reminded me of Swindon on a Saturday night. So, yeah, Varney the Vampire. He was around for 50, 60 years before Bram Stoker wrote Dracula. But everything in Dracula was basically taken from Varney the Vampire. And yeah, he was the original vampire, created by a guy called James Reimer. So I will take a moment to read you a section from A Penny Dreadful of the Time describing a typical day in the life of Varney the Vampire. Yeah? The figure turns half round and the light falls upon its face. It is perfectly white, perfectly bloodless. The eyes look like polished tin, the lips are drawn back, and the principal feature next to these dreadful eyes is the teeth, projecting like those of some wild animal, hideously glaring white and fang-like. It approaches the bed with a strange gliding movement. It clashes together its long nails that literally appear to hang from finger ends. No sound comes from its lips. The storm has ceased. All is still. The winds are hushed. The church clock proclaims the hour of 1. A hissing sound comes from the throat of the hideous being as he raises his long gaunt arms. The lips move. He advances. The girl places one small foot from the bed onto the floor. She is unconsciously dragging the clothing with her. The door of the room is in which direction? Can she reach it? With a sudden rush that could not be foreseen, with a strange howling cry that was enough to awaken terror in every breast, the figure seized the long tresses of her hair and, twining them round his bony hands, he held her to the bed. Then she screamed. Heaven granted her then the power to scream. Shriek followed shriek in rapid succession. The bedclothes fell in a heap by the side of the bed, and she was dragged by her long silken hair onto it again. Her beautiful rounded limbs quivered with the agony of her soul. The glassy, horrible eyes of the figure ran over the angelic form with a hideous satisfaction. Oh, horrible profanation! He drags her head to the bed's edge. He forces it back by the long hair entwined in his grasp. With a plunge, he seizes her neck in his fang-like teeth. There's a gush of blood and a hideous sucking noise. The girl has swooned, and the vampire is at his hideous repast. Don't have nightmares.
Usual cabinet meeting.
Right. So the other one, apart from Varney, there was one other character, Sweeney Todd the barber. A guy called Thomas Prest actually sent the story that he'd written called Thomas, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, and it was accepted. And it became one of the most and longest living success stories of Sweeney Todd. It's been in opera, it's been in plays, it's been in everything. And it went on for many, many, many episodes. So I just thought I'd take it right, the story, after like 200 episodes, I'll take it right to the end point where the police capture Sweeney Todd, and the police inspector is charged with telling the long queue outside Mrs. Lovett's pie shop next door what's been happening. And the interesting bit is not so much the explanation, as you'll hear, but the very kind of Victorian way of reacting to it. Ladies and gentlemen, I fear that what I'm going to say will spoil your appetites. But truth is beautiful, and I have to state that Mrs. Lovett's pies are made of human flesh. How the throng of persons recoiled. What a roar of agony and dismay there was. How frightfully sick about 40 lawyers' clerks became. They spat out the gelatinous, clinging portions of the pies they'd been devouring. The exclamations from the consumers, once they could find their tongues, said, "Good gracious! Oh, those pies! And damn, confound it!" Yeah, very, very different. But yeah, one of the most very successful characters ever created. When we get to the 1860s, 1870s, it's pirates that suddenly become the focus of the Penny Dreadfuls. Everyone loves pirates, and pirate stories kind of took over as the main kind of theme. Stories of buccaneers and tropical islands, and yeah, they all kind of looked a bit like this chap. And again, from the book, it tells us about how popular these sea stories were with the youth. It says, the seas were cluttered with spectral barks and gallows ships, with men hanging from every available spar from the yardarm to the flying jib boom. When the hero of the story, cheated of his inheritance, eventually put to sea, there were hags in the hold, hunchbacks in the rigging. The pirate chief would prove to be an insane wooden-legged wild man, glittering with jewels as big as pigeons' eggs, who would dine in his saloon with half a dozen skeletons. All that remained of the masters and midshipmen of Her Majesty's sloops sent to take him. Setting up skeletons for the captain's table was only one of a score of gruesome tasks for the ship's surgeon under the skull and crossbones flag. He had to be an anatomist of no mean attainments. I think we've all been to dinner parties like that, haven't we, at some point in time. Yeah, the pirates became very, very popular. The longest ever and most successful, as it says, serialised story in comic history, Dick Turpin was the absolute hero of the Penny Dreadfuls for nigh on 90 years with his horse Black Bess. And this was a serial that went on for, I think, over 200 episodes. And sometimes they didn't even finish the sentence after 8 pages of reading prose. They'd leave it till the next week when you carried on the story. Yeah, but this was the most successful serialised story, a guy in love with his horse. And even though he was a highwayman, he was kind of looked upon by the masses as being kind of an anti-hero because he could never be caught. Now this chap's very, very interesting. Again, it's one of the most, to our grandfathers and great-grandfathers, this would be, Spring-Heeled Jack would be the one character they remembered. And he's the kind of British equivalent of Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, because unlike all the other characters in comic history, he had an idea to fix little springs about this high under the sole of his 2 shoes. So he used to bounce up and down on his springs, and he could leap over houses, he could leap over all sorts of things, and the police could never catch him because he could bounce around. I mean, imagine Superman putting up with that. It just wouldn't happen. But you can see he dressed up a bit like a bat. So this is way before pre-Batman. And he's there. He's a kind of a Robin Hood character who kind of robs from the rich and gives to the poor and leaps around on his springs. And he has a long 50 or 60 year history of being a superhero until one day, I mean, you're going to laugh, but this is true. One day, the springs get a bit rusty and they fall off the bottom of his shoes, and the police are then able to nab him. It's a bit of an anticlimax, really, isn't it? But yeah, I don't know what the Americans would have made of that, but there you go. So, the Boy's Own, yeah. What happened is the Penny Dreadfuls ruled the waves. They ruled juvenile literature from about 1840 up to 1879. And then in 1879, this changed the whole history of comics, because there was a vicar who was fed up reading all this gore, and it was sad that the children were reading all the stuff that I've just been reading out. And what he wanted was to create a boys' paper, the Boy's Own paper, and he wanted it to be very Christian, very wholesome, have story of the Boy Scouts, have stories about famous historical characters, explorers, for example, have uplifting information, make it really well printed, very good pictures, check the grammar, check the spelling, check the paragraphing, make it look something special. And he succeeded. And it was the most successful of all the boys' papers, and it turned from boys' paper into sort of comic form. And you can see here one from, I think that's probably the 1940s, and that one's back in 1899 or something. But very, very successful. This is the guy who actually created it. So it's 1879, he brings out the Boy's Own paper, and this is his wife, Mrs. Beeton, and she's the Mrs. Beeton of the famous Beeton's Cookery Book, and How to Run a Household. My mum had a copy in the kitchen where I grew up. So this is the famous Mrs. Beeton. She also created the Girl's Own comic, which was equally successful to her husband's Boy's Own comic. And there are a number of examples around the room of the Girl's Own comic. And again, they were very, very positive, uplifting kind of stuff. But it was also exciting. When you read the Boy's Own paper, you were in for a real treat because the stories were well written and they were full of exciting stuff. When there was an interview with this guy, Mr. Beeton, a journalist was asking him about his writers who wrote for Boy's Own Paper, and he said, "Oh, they're fine, upstanding chaps. You know, they really are good Christian, good people." And he said, "Oh, what do you think of the writers who write for the Penny Dreadfuls?" This is his answer. "As a rule, they're drunken, sodden creatures whose lives have been one long unbroken story of failure. Sometimes they're university men who in the flower of their youth gave promise by becoming noblemen, but giving away to the temptations of drink, they have gradually sunk lower and lower in the scale of life until they have reached the depths of degradation, and their natures have become so debased they are fit only to write evil stories which fill the pocket of the man who prints those awful penny dreadfuls." That was his opinion. Yes, but to be fair, he succeeded in making a really, really successful boys' paper. And the other thing that happened with the Boys' Own Paper and the Girls' Own Paper, it was the first time that the editor invited readers to send in questions. So if you're a reader of the Boys' Paper or the Girls' Own Paper, you had any question at all, you could go send a letter and you'd get an answer in the next edition addressed to you. So I picked out one, and this is taken directly from one of the old boys, the Boys' Owns on the table. This is what the Boys' Own editor wrote back to the question. "A most interesting query comes from Roy Walker of South Shields, who asks my views about boys having girls as chums. My older members know exactly the opinions I hold about boy and girl friendships. I feel they can serve a healthy and useful purpose if they're carried on with the full approval of the parents on both sides, provided no foolish thought of courtship is indulged in. A lad feels there is something in the friendship of a girl chum that uplifts him and fills him with a desire to live well, keep steady and do great deeds. And as long as both parties to the friendship remain true to themselves, I am sure no fair-minded man or woman would wish to deny them the happiness they deserve." So, yeah, you could write in and get that kind of response. The other thing, though, is it was of its time. So as well as having a kind of agony aunt section and a letter section, they would also have an arts and crafts section where every month or every week, whenever you bought your Boys' Own Paper or Girls' Own Paper, you could be instructed on how to build something amazing or create something amazing. But at the time, 1890s, some of the choices of things that a boy should do or a girl was a bit odd. So I'll read out a typical example of what they're saying. You know, on a boring Sunday afternoon, a boring rainy Sunday afternoon, boys, if you want something to keep you amused, taxidermy, yeah. Find a large bird, a dead one. And this was the instructions, and this is absolutely serious. This is the instructions in the Boys' Own Paper for how to spend a Sunday afternoon, yeah? How to do taxidermy on a large bird. If the head is very much larger than the neck, cut the throat lengthways to remove the head. It is immaterial whether the eyes are taken out before the head is skinned down or after. The gouge should go well to the back of the eye and separate the ligaments which holds it to the socket. Should the gouge go into the eye, it will allow out some moisture, which often damages the skin. So some people crush the skull slightly to make sure it comes out of the skin easily. But this I do not advise. Then remove the brains by taking out a piece of the skull at the back as you cut off the neck. Pull the eyes out of their cavities and fill up their place with wool soaked in arsenical soap. Anoint the skin of the head and the neck well with arsenical soap and place in the neck a piece of stick covered with wool, the end of which is put into the hole made in the skull for extracting the brains. This is a fun and enjoyable way to spend an afternoon. Yeah. So I remember reading a Boys' Own when I was young, and I was sitting there with my sister, and she had a copy of the Girls' Own comic. And I was reading, it was something not as bad as that. It said, how to build a pirate ship with a few boxes of matches, a penknife and a bit of glue. And it had a picture of this matchstick-made pirate ship, and I'm going, oh, wow, I'm going to make a pirate ship out of matches with my glue and my penknife. And I said to my sister, how's your Girls' Own comic? Have you got something to do? And she says, yes, it's telling me how to embroider a handkerchief. Enough said. Yes. So here's the Girls' Own paper. Again, same absolute top-notch quality, much, much better than the Penny Dreadfuls, and very successful. And over the years, by the 1930s, 1940s, it's in colour. It's a good 40 or 50 pages that you get. And this is the superhero of the Girls' Own paper. This is Kitty Hawk, who's the female equivalent of Biggles, if you like. An adventurer with her own biplane that travels around having lots of adventures. So, yeah, and there's some examples around the room of the Girls' Own comic. So, I mentioned earlier on that character pre-Sherlock Holmes. This is Sexton Blake. For about 60 years, he was the ultimate detective, and very, very popular right through to the 50s and 60s. And he had his own comic. The character was created in this particular comic, The Union Jack, which again was kind of just a little bit before the Boys' Own paper, but it was a good, wholesome comic. It wasn't a penny dreadful, and had some amazing adventure stories. They were so successful, in fact, that he went on to get his very own paper. So he starred in his own paper, Detective Weekly, which is a very, very popular comic for kind of a bit like Agatha Christie, try and solve the mystery of the crime alongside Sexton Blake. And again, another character, Billy Bunter. On the table here are a few gems and a few magnets. By about 1940s, 1950s, public schoolboy stories had the ascendancy. They moved past the pirate and the vampires, and it got into public schoolboy stories, and loads and loads of comics focused on kind of Tom Brown's school days type of adventures. And Bunter was a bit of an anti-hero, but he went on to be very, very successful in plays, opera. Even in the 1960s, some of you who, if you're long in the tooth enough, you might remember a series of The Adventures of Billy Bunter in the 60s. Yeah, so a great, great character, and lots of traits that you can relate to in standing up to the bullies, and getting caught and getting the cane now and then, but a great comic character. So by the time we move into the 40s and the early 50s, what's happened is the dominance of radio starts to take over, and radio stars during the war years certainly became almost as famous as like pop stars are today. They became so popular they started to get their own comics, and with the growth of the cinema as well, the cinema was very popular, and you had film stars. So the comics reflected that, again, in social history. And you get lots of comics called things like Radio Fun, there he is, Charlie Drake, and Film Fun with Laurel and Hardy. So they're reflecting the tastes of the age. In the 50s and in the 40s and 50s, the interest in radio and early television is being reflected in the comics. And again, 1950 was the Eagle was launched, and was one of the most successful boys' comics. The quality of the artwork, the quality of the stories and the characters were unsurpassed. And this is the comic I grew up with. This is the one I used to get every single week when I was a child. And I didn't throw a single one away. I kept them in a pile beside the bed. And I just loved the hero of the Eagle, of course, on the front cover and the back cover is Dan Dare, the astronaut, who is not made of ice or rubber or rock. He's a stiff upper-lipped British chap who smokes his pipe, and even when there's aliens attacking Earth from all directions, he'll just sit there puffing on his pipe, thinking about how he can save the planet. And he's a cool guy. It was lovely to read every week the story of how he defeated the attacking vegans, when that word had a very different meaning They were the hostile aliens from planet Vega. And I think today he'd turn in his grave at how many vegans are taking over the world. But there you go. Yes, he defeated the vegans and now they're coming back in force. And there's another example of another very successful comic that capitalised particularly on things like Doctor Who and the Thunderbirds and Stingray and Fireball and all these kind of things. And they made it into a kind of like a newspapery look to it, and they're full colour, and they reflected what was going on. You could watch Thunderbirds on TV, and then you could read your TV21, and it was full of sort of TV stars that children would relate to. So a very, very successful comic. Now, Dandy. Yeah, this is number one of the Dandy. Number ones are always worth 10 times more than a number two or number three. And very recently, they're extremely hard to find, they're extremely rare, but as it says there, very recently, a Dandy, oh, that's number two. Number two sold for 7,400 at auction, which is tells you something about, you know, the collecting of these old comics. It's very hard to find, certainly comics in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I was looking on eBay a couple of days ago, that edition of eBay, Beano, I think that's number one, yeah, is on for 500. So yeah, there's an enormous interest in old comics with collectors, and the history kind of reflects all the main themes culturally through the ages. And by end of 1970s, beginning of 1980s, it's all beginning to fall away, because by the 80s you've got multiple TV channels coming through, you've got the dawn of computers, you've got video, you've got magazines coming out all over the place, and children's interest in buying a weekly comic sort of died down. Only the Beano is the only one that has survived to this day. Beano started in 1938, but the Beano you get down Griffiths, I went down this morning just to check, and is nothing like the Beano I grew up with. When I grew up, you could read a Beano and you could be amused for 2 hours. You could have 2 hours of reading, but the current Beano's 10 minutes, and it's all cartoons, it's hardly any words, it's a shadow of its former self, which is very sad. But it was really from about 1980 that the steep decline in sales went down. And so collectors today, you know, my grandfather might have collected the Penny Dreadfuls. The rarest comics, the most expensive ones, are not the Penny Dreadfuls from the 1800s, 1840s. They're actually from the 2 World Wars. Because in both World Wars, there was a paper shortage, and every household was encouraged to actually recycle all their paper, all newspapers and all the comics, and they did. And for that reason, finding any comics from the First World War period or the Second World War are very, very hard to find and very rare. I've got 2 or 3 which you can look at here. So, the end of comics as we know it. Oh, wrong way. Does anyone recognise this book? Yeah. Did you all read The Famous Five when you were young, and The Adventures of Enid Blyton's Famous Five? Wonderful books, wonderful stories. I've also collected a few of these books. And if someone asks me why children of today have zero interest in all these wonderful comics, maybe the answer's this. It's been brought up to date for 2025. So that's a whirlwind trip through the history of comics, old boys' papers, girls' comics. As I said, it's not just about the comics, it's an exhibition. Please have a look before you go tonight, have a look at the comics, and feel free to turn them over, look at the back cover. They're all in cellophane just to keep the sort of fingerprints off. But any questions?
Yeah. I was an Eagle reader. And I always used to look forward to the exploded diagrams. Yes, Coronation Scott, the Comet Stratocruiser and Panzer Tank and things like that. And I wonder, did the Eagle start the exploded diagram, do you know, or did they come before?
Started.
Mainly they started, it was quite innovative, but there was another comic which is on the back table called Look and Learn, which was a very educational kind of comic, and that had some diagrams like that which they exploded. But I think the Eagle became famous for being the innovators of it, and then Look and Learn took it on as well, and yeah, carried it on.
They're really good.
Yeah, famous for them.
Could I just make a comment in relation to that question? Because I had a copy of Eagle number 1, 2, 3, and so on, and the exploded diagrams certainly were in Eagle number 1, as I recall. I had all of these Eagles, I must have had about 50 or so, packed into cardboard backing, were left home, and my mother threw them all out. They disappeared. But
That's sad.
could I just make a comment about the penny dreadfuls?
Yeah.
Having seen I think the images on the front covers of the penny dreadfuls are fantastic. The quality of the art is amazing.
Yeah.
In some ways, much better than that which followed.
Yeah.
But anyhow, and a question about the comics. In that, I recall there used to be annuals, comic annuals, which you haven't referred to. They always appeared just before Christmas.
Yeah.
And became Christmas presents, so you bought, the Beano annual or whatever. How do they fit into the story?
Well,
And a final point, I remember that alongside the Eagle and the other comics, my parents bought me the children's newspaper, which, was it a comic? I'm not quite sure. I don't know whether you have any copies of the children's newspaper, but of course, if you were given the opportunity to read the children's newspaper or Dan Dare, well, there was no competition.
No, I haven't come across the children's newspaper. I must have missed out on that one. If I'd have seen it in the shops when I was collecting, I would have probably picked it up. But no, the annuals, yeah. I won't tell you how many annuals I've got in my collection because Jane will hear it. But yes, every Christmas wasn't Christmas unless you got the annual of your favourite comic. So yeah, every Christmas I would be kind of writing my letter to Father Christmas, hoping for an Eagle annual, and my other one was Rupert. As long as I got those two annuals, I was well happy. And again, I've got almost every Rupert ever printed in the collection. But yeah, and the artwork, you say, yeah, it was exceptional. It was very gothic, very dark. But they got some very good artists to do it, and they toned it down quite a bit. What you have to remember is the pictures were only on the front cover.
Yes.
There's nothing, you turn the page and it's just dense prose, but yeah, some great artwork. Yeah.
Joe, those Penny Dreadful stories, did they have happy endings? Or did they have usually sad endings? Did Varney the Vampire?
Well, I know with the most famous one, which was went on the longest for thousands of pages and 200 episodes, was Dick Turpin and his adventures with Black Bess, his horse. And the last episode, his horse died. So that was kind of the end of the story. And
So all of Varney the Vampire, they were just episodes in a sort of serial.
it was all serials, yeah, because the idea was you created a cliffhanger in the last sentence to get them to buy it the following week. Yeah, and so they would leave the hero in an impossible situation. Like there was one I was reading where a serial where a guy falls into a river and he's being swept down towards a huge waterfall, and there's crocodiles snapping in a circle around him in the last sentence. And then when you get to the next edition the following week, it says, he leapt onto a boulder and onto the bank. Yeah, it's a bit of a Yeah, they've captured you though by then. Yes. Yeah.
I've got another one.
Yeah.
Early 60s, break time, there was always a brisk trade of what we call trash mags, which were the little sort of quarter-sized war comics.
Yes.
Where the plucky English troops were always saying, "Die, you blockhead."
Yes.
Did you not mention those?
No, there was, they're a different sort of genre. They are what they call the war comics. One was Commando, which was very common. Yeah, I have got some of those. They don't tend to, I think you have collectors specifically for those types of comics. Yeah, the war comics are quite popular. I didn't collect any of them. I picked them up here and there and got a few. But yeah, they're very popular.
Are they short-lived then?
No, there's still collectors out there today who are hunting them.
They not produce them?
No, they produced them for many years. Yeah. They're still sought by collectors, although they're not printed anymore. Yeah. Sorry, Andrea.
In what do you store all your comics and?
Yeah, you have. I put all the comics into cellophane. That's really because the sweat from the hands can cause damage, and damp is the biggest threat to a comic collection. So I just buy these big plastic tubs and put them in the cellophane, put them in the plastic tub, so if it rains or there's damp, they're still protected, and that's done them fine for many, many years. Yeah, but I thought when I was a child, when I started collecting in the back streets of Brighton, I remember consciously thinking, rather than going to the shop and buying sweets, I'll buy like 50 comics for 10 pence or whatever, because you could do that in those days. And I thought, when I get to about age 60, I'm going to sell them all and be a millionaire. Hasn't happened yet. No, I haven't sold them. I haven't become the millionaire, but there you go. It's been a joy anyway. Anyone else got any questions? Yes, another one at the back.
So what would the graphic content and storyline be now? Where would you see it continuing?
The storyline.
The graphic, the strong imaging of comics. Like, newspaper strips, it's usually like three in a little thing.
Yeah, I mean, comics have always evolved right from the start. And I think now, looking at a Beano this morning in Griffiths, which I did, each page has probably got 4 blocks, four sections. And it's very good, high quality colour, but they're not saying very much, just a few simple to read words. And there's no real storyline. There's a kind of attempt at pretty poor comedy. But it goes back to the social history. The comics going through kind of the vampires are powerful, and then it's Dick Turpin, the highwaymen, then it's the pirates and the buccaneers, and then it's the space explorers, and it goes through fads. What the fad would be now, gosh, I have no idea. I'm not in touch that much with what the youth of today would be reading, because to be honest, I don't see them doing much reading. They look at as you say, they look at their phones a lot. But certainly with my grown-up children, I very, very rarely see them with a book in their hands, or even a comic. So I'd struggle to come up with an answer as to what a good storyline would be today. Maybe How to Be a Pop Star or something. Don't know. Yeah.
Well, the comic I'm still reading, which started 50 years ago, 2000 AD, they started a story last week about vampires.
Really? Yeah, that 2000 AD is another very, very successful comic, and I've got a lot of them as well. They kind of broke the mould when they came out, and it's very collectible as well.
Well, they've just brought back Fiends of the Eastern Front. It's Fiends of the Western Front, which you might remember from 1978.
Yeah. And they've gone to vampires now, have they?
Yeah, the vampires have been...
They come full circle then.
Yeah, like Durham Red in Strontium Gold, and the Captain Constanta, Fiends of the Western, Fiends of the Eastern Front. Wow. Yeah, it's been a theme all the way through.
Yeah, it's a great comic. I mean, some of the artwork in that was kind of game changing for lots of comics.
Well, a lot of their writers came from girls' comics, didn't they?
I don't know. I don't
Most
know.
of the writers for girls' comics in the 70s and 80s
Yeah.
were men, like John Wagner.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Oh,
they
right.
moved on to the Victor, 2000 AD, Star-Lord, that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. No, keep them. They're very valuable. 2000 AD. I know there's a lot of people who just focus on collecting that particular comic.
Yeah, it's £4.95 a week.
Is it? Ah.
You've got a very big collection. Do you claim to have read them all?
No, no. I have my favourites. I mean, I read all the Eagles because I used to get them every week as a child, and I think the other ones I enjoy sitting down sometimes to read are the old public schoolboy stories, like the Bunter stories, kind of the adventures of public schoolboys, and yeah, that attracted me. So I've read quite a lot of the Magnet and Gem, the public schoolboy stories. But no, the others I dip into, but I don't really read them as much. No, but they're all good stories. I think that it's hard to read the Penny Dreadfuls because the print is so small and so dense and so bad. The grammar's so bad and the spelling's so bad, and it's just a hard graft to try and read it. But the more you go from about 1890 onwards, it's much more easy to read. Yeah.
Thanks so much indeed, Joe. That was brilliant. And you've already seen some of the comics that are on display, and Joe's very kindly got them out. So I'm sure you'd be more than happy for people to have a look after.
Absolutely, yeah. Do come and have a look round. There's some things you'll never see again in your life, I'm sure.
I think you'll all agree. It's been a fascinating evening. Really enjoyed Joe's talk. So can I ask you to show your appreciation?